China held a military parade at Zhurehe training base in North China's Inner Mongolia autonomous region in celebration of the 90th anniversary of the founding of the Chinese People's Liberation Army. What does the parade signify for China and its military forces?
I firmly believe that our gallant military has both the confidence and the ability to defeat all intruders.
To strengthen China's military and bring it up to date, President Xi Jinping began a comprehensive military reform program in 2012. What has been achieved and what challenges remain? China is playing a more active role in international military cooperation and deepening defense and security ties with other countries. To what extent is China contributing to peace in the region and beyond? In line with its increasing international responsibility, China has been taking measures such as dispatching peacekeepers and strengthening military-to-military cooperation. What else needs to be done to further promote responsible leadership?
Since its foundation on August 1, 1927, the People's Liberation Army has been developing its capacity for safeguarding national sovereignty and territorial integrity against a full range of challenges. What traditions and spirit are being carried forward and enriched in its current development? How is the ongoing reform shaping the military's enhanced capability, and what role is the PLA playing both domestically and internationally in today's context? To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Zhu Chenghu, retired Major General at the PLA National Defense University, and Zhou Bo, Senior Colonel at the Ministry of National Defense. That's our topic. This is a dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to the discussion here. President Xi Jinping says in his keynote presentation marking the 90th anniversary of the PLA founding that China would never seek to have aggression or expansion. However, we are able, by the way, to defend all kinds of invasion. I have noticed the emphasis of media coverage, extensive media coverage today, that President Xi Jinping vows to pretend the territorial integrity would never allow any form of secession with whatever excuse. What does he mean by emphasizing the protection of the territorial integrity at this defining moment of the military build-up?
I think you have used the right word to emphasize, because this has been a policy, never to budge an inch of Chinese territory to any invaders. So when he talks about this, in my mind, I actually was thinking of two scenarios. One is about Taiwan, the other is about China-Indian border. Because on Taiwan, the issue is quite clear, because China is still a country that is not reunified. So, and of course, that would also spill over to the territorial dispute at sea. But at Dongguan right now, Chinese soldiers are having standing off with Indian soldiers, which is clearly is Chinese territory. So, standing on Chinese territory, what will happen? The Chinese soldiers can only be more determined than the Indian soldiers who actually trespass into the territory of third countries. So time is on our side.
And your interpretations about the message that President Xi Jinping delivers to the international community about the impact of China's armed forces and its modernization?
I think it's quite understandable. If you look at history from 1840, China has been repeatedly invaded by foreign powers. So this is, I think the reason why the invasions or intrusions had happened is the fact that China was weak in its military. Therefore, to defend the national territorial integrity and sovereignty, I think we will have to have strong and modernized armed forces.
What you say reminded me of what Governor Chris Patten, the last governor of Hong Kong before 1997, and he said in an exclusive interview with me a few years ago, he said, Ray, for the past 20 centuries, out of 18, China had been the most powerful economically, and yet many articles pointed out in commemorating the anniversary of the Opium War or the Qing-Japanese War, the Jiawu Zhenzhen, they said when China was powerful in terms of GDP, we could still be easily invaded by overseas powers. And therefore, when American scholars ask me, hi, what do you mean? Why do you have to have a strong armed force when we, the United States, could provide the security umbrella in ensuring freedom of navigation and of overflight in South China Sea, Indian Ocean, so on and so forth? What's the necessity and the importance for China to have its own military might? Now, what would be your most likely answer?
Of course, you have to rely on yourself for your own national defense. Well, take the Song Dynasty, for example. At that time, China economically was also very prosperous, but the Song Dynasty was weak because it doesn't have a strong defense. How could China, such a large country, rely its own national security and defense on foreign powers? This is ridiculous.
And they say China is, and we also declare we are the most populous and biggest developing country, and therefore why so much has been spent on the military build-up. What's the issue with the military spending, the budget? They say, you know, that's the second biggest after the United States.
Yeah, I think it's also understandable. If you look at history, the reason why China was invaded by foreign powers repeatedly and why we are speeding up the modernization process are very clear. Number one, it was because we were looking behind the advanced powers. And in the past, before 1840, we were not invaded by Western powers, but with the advance of the technologies, so the Western powers could have been able to develop very large fleet and very advanced weaponry and weapon systems. Therefore, they could have been able to invade China. Otherwise, they would not have the capability. And such as circumstances, I think we got one important lesson. That is, if you are weak militarily, you will be invaded. And as far as the present process of modernization drive of China, I think it's also quite understandable. It is because China is facing very complicated security environment, which is very, very unique in the world. We are facing all the challenges and the threats that the other major powers are facing. But we are also facing a lot of challenges and the threats that are not faced by Western powers. For example, the close-range reconnaissance against China. Why is it necessary? If you are not preparing a war against China, why do you have to do this? So under such circumstances, if we rely the other powers to protect China's security interest or China's security, I'm really wondering if it's reliable.
Gentlemen, I've been doing homework about how the overseas media and politicians, observers, look at the military build-up in China. They say no one will invade China because you have the nuclear weaponry, you have missiles, you have very advanced weaponry of different kinds. Even in the outer space, we could down the outdated weather satellite with cruise missiles. And therefore, many, including some of the Chinese observers, point out the biggest threat actually comes from within instead of from without. For example, corruption. One major reason for the Chinese Navy to be defeated towards the end of the 19th century by the Japanese Navy was the rampant corruption of the Qing dynasty. Today, President Xi Jinping, also chairman of the Central Military Commission, undertook a profound and comprehensive anti-graft campaign within the military barracks, within the military of the PLA. Do you think this serves to help build the strength and the capability of the Chinese armed forces?
Well, actually, you have asked two questions. First of all, I disagree strongly with the point that the threat only comes from within, because even externally, we still have Taiwan, which is not reunified. Of course, we undertake not to use force easily, but we will not abandon the use of force if they declare independence for us, for example. And we still have threats. Who is actually conducting the surveillance and reconnaissance in our EEZ almost on a daily basis? And apart from that, the other responsibility for PLA it is to shoulder increasingly its international obligations to provide security goods to the international community. Otherwise, why would you have the largest armed force in the world? So for the Chinese military, nowadays there are actually two responsibilities. One is to safeguard your own national security, which is understandable. The other is to go overseas to safeguard two things. Number one, China's ever-growing national interest overseas, and second, to show the China's international responsibility. Talking about corruption, of course, that is a proven fact that which has strongly affected the credibility, the health development of PLA. But we have the courage to correct our own wrongdoings, even by toppling down the two top brass in Western term, right? So we have shown stamina, courage to correct our own mistakes and to make our armed forces stronger.
But the Chinese armed forces haven't been able to fight a single fight since the early 1980s, and most of the soldiers are actually the only child of the Chinese families. Therefore, there is a strong skeptical voice as to the combat capability of the army, to say nothing of the Blue Water Navy, or the Air Force, the missile forces, cyber warfare. Let's look at these concerns. Now, with this, some of the skeptical observers from outside say the PLA is not ready yet.
What I want to argue is the fact that we have never been prepared ourselves fully for a war. So is
that a curse or blessing for the military build-up?
Yeah, that's right.
Is that a curse or blessing?
Yeah, this is one of the reasons. Of course, I believe that we have some problems, we have some challenges.
No, you didn't answer me directly. Is it a curse or blessing for a healthy development of the Chinese armed forces? Since we haven't picked a fight since the early 1980s. Now, without having real capability to fight, put your ground troops put your boot on the ground to fight a real enemy in the battlefield, how could you prove your capability?
I think this is actually a problem of the tradition. If you look at the traditions of Chinese PLA, I don't think.
So you think this is a challenge? This is a problem?
These are the problems. These are the challenges.
Disadvantages.
But this could be addressed very easily in the PLA. I think we can address this sort of issues like no long time, no war, like one-child policy. But we will have to see that the combat spirit is still there. The glorious traditions are still there.
Well, the spirit of patriotism, the spirit of morale, that is politically correct. That is the talking point of the media. But let's look at the real capability, combat capability of the Chinese armed forces. What's your take about the alleged vulnerability of the Chinese armed forces? Because they haven't fought a single battle ever since the 1980s.
That is true, but to answer your question directly, that is a blessing for the world, because China doesn't need to pick up a fight with anybody. In the last 20 years, China certainly has gone through many crises, from the bombing of Chinese embassy in Yugoslavia, from the collision aircraft, but China actually has managed all this with restraint, with rationale, with a reason. It doesn't mean that you haven't gone through these wars, then you are not capable. Because let me give you, the U.S. have been involved in almost non-stop for the last 20 years. So what? So does that mean that they become stronger? Not necessarily. What have these wars produced? Exodus of refugees, massive killing, and a few body bags for the American soldiers themselves. Even the United States itself, there are so many debates about the advantages and disadvantages of these wars. So, and President...
I'm afraid that some of the readers of the Global Times, for example, would disagree with you seriously. They say, when you look at the issue of innocent passage in the territorial waters of the Chinese islands in the South China Sea by a fleet from the Pentagon, we did nothing except for watching out closely. And therefore, the Chinese Navy was accused of being the first to blink in the standoff between our two militaries. They say this is a sign of a weakness. Instead of being a blessing or blessing the world peace, brass of the Pentagon would first of all prioritize the issue of defending their national interests and sovereignty instead of talking smart about world peace.
I disagree strongly to these opinions. They are just naive, because neither United States nor China would consider these kind of things as necessarily to be belligerent.
Senior
The
Colonel,
point is,
let me remind you, what is the most popular movie at this moment in the cinema, in the Chinese domestic market? It's the Wolf Warrior 2. What it talks about our overseas capability to fight militias in Africa, to save our nationals, because as you said earlier, our global stakes are scattered throughout the whole world, particularly soft targets of Chinese tourists, Chinese workers who are involved in the Belt and Road Initiative. They need to be protected, and they could be taken hostage by the local militias and terrorists.
Yes.
What would the flotilla in Somali waters do in this case? Of course, at the end of this movie, we fired cruise missiles, we killed those militias. But this is just fantasy. It's just a world of virtuality. It is imagination. It's not a real story. However, you cannot deny this movie has aroused a strong nationalist feeling.
But
they need to be protected.
But why would you stress so much on the movie? What is happening really?
Exactly. We have built great expectations for the military, who should protect the lives and the property of the Chinese nationals.
But aren't our Navy protecting our people already? What are they doing in the Gulf of Aden? What are they doing in peacekeeping? What are they doing
fighting
in
piracy? Fighting piracy, okay.
Peacekeeping there? Fighting piracy?
I think this story is actually based on the massive
two
evacuation of Chinese nationals in Libya after the Arab Spring broke out. Now, millions of dollars worth of Chinese properties and equipment in Libya were lost, sacrificed.
Yeah,
and what was our military doing there?
Really, I agree with you.
Except
but
for
these
the
are two different
evacuation of
things.
the nationals. What else did we do? Did we kill those who caused the heavy loss of our properties?
These are two different stories and two different things, because the passage of U.S. fleet from the through Chinese Sea, South China Sea, is legal. If you read the UNCLOS, I think that sort of mission is legal, but if they enter us into the 12 nautical miles of Chinese territorial water, that's a different story. But most actions of the American fleet are outside of the 12 nautical miles of the maritime water of China. So
the point of my questions, gentlemen, is you cannot underestimate the impact of the rising nationalism today in the case of our withdrawing Chinese property and nationals from Libya and in the South China Sea. They don't want PLA to be viewed as being weak. Okay?
No, that is just nonsense, bullshit. At that time, when the people tried to evacuate those people stranded in Libya, definitely our capability wasn't so strong. It is not that PLA wasn't doing anything. Within the 4 Illusion aircraft, within 2 weeks, we have evacuated 35,000 people, including foreigners. So Chinese PLA is doing its best. Right now, we have to admit that we have a strong disadvantage in terms of power projections. That is true. And that is why we are just trying to improve it. That is why we have built Y-20. So the capability is being formed, is being made. Rome is not made in a day. So is the PLA. It takes time, but we definitely will be there.
And Americans keep asking this question. Who is your enemy? What's your strategic intent? What is the transparency of your military budget? Do you take the U.S. as the public enemy number one? That's a matter of how to assess the biggest threats for China's national security in the new era. What do you think should be our response to the American concerns? Because they say China would be the only most legitimate competitor militarily for the U.S. to maintain and protect its maritime primacy, so to speak, in the South China Sea.
Number one, in my understanding, according to the strategic policy of China, secessionist forces in Taiwan should be the primary enemy. Number two, Chinese do not want to be an enemy of the United States. But if the Americans want to turn China into its primary enemy, we will have to follow. So this is two different things.
It's what we call the self-fulfilling prophecy. If you take China as your enemy, we'll be your enemy.
We will be enemy, yeah. We will try to be a qualified enemy of the United States. Mm-hmm. And thirdly, about the current issue, especially those areas which are posing serious challenges to China's national security, like South China, Korean Peninsula, all these issues. China and the United States share a lot of common grounds, but of course we have differences. And these differences are very difficult to be addressed, in my understanding.
Another thing that has impressed international observers about the military parade on Sunday was not only President Xi Jinping was wearing, for the first time, paramount leader of China was wearing camouflage fatigues, and that impressed a lot of those Western observers. They say this is very unique, this is provocative. They use the word provocative to describe the way President Xi Jinping was dressed up on this particular occasion. Now, first of all, the uniform, and second, they say a lot of the hardware, the military hardware, 40% of them, the brand new military hardware, was homemade, and therefore they argue this is indeed a formidable force to reckon with. First of all, how do you look at their comments on, the camouflage fatigue of our commander-in-chief, Mr. Xi Jinping? Was it a provocative gesture for our competitors and enemy?
I don't think that is provocative at all, because that is in the training basis where it's almost a semi-desert condition, and he is reviewing all the troops in the field. So it's natural for him, the super commander of PLA, to wear camouflage dress. That is
but none of his predecessors were ever wearing the camouflage fatigues. So he made a big difference, and therefore they try to read into the difference with a lot of imagination. Okay, they say, this is a reflection of a Chinese assertiveness in the military build-up.
I think right now the fact is the Central Military Commission has a greater power, and he, being chairman of Central Military Commission, would like to send the right message, if that could be taken as a kind of message. So that is nothing wrong with it. George W. Bush, once on an aircraft carrier, also wear kind of fighter's jacket.
Shinzo Abe was wearing the camouflage fatigue on top of a tank, right? Also in a fighter jet.
Yeah.
This time around, very advanced fighter jets like the stealth fighter and the Dongfeng 21D, which was said to be the killer of aircraft carrier. Obviously, the understatement refers to the U.S. Aircraft carrier strike groups. So what do you think of the implied message here?
Number one, I think this parade is mainly shown to the Chinese. So it shows that the military expenditure spent in the military is not spent in the vain. So these are the results of the R&D of the military defense industry. Secondly, we haven't fought a single war for so many years. How could we demonstrate our capabilities? How could we demonstrate our advancement in the technologies and armor equipment? So this is the way for us to demonstrate these sort of capabilities and the development of the hardwares.
An important part of the centerpiece in his keynote presentation at the event marking the 90th anniversary of the PLA founding was he and the whole of the Central Military Commission have been able to rebuild this army, rebuild the image, rebuild the capability, and rebuild the structure of the military command and control center. So can you sum up the core issues, I mean the essence of the comprehensive military reform?
Well, I think what we are doing is absolutely on the right track, because we so far have finished all the reform at the above shoulders level, and we are now restructuring the whole armed forces. And the academic institutions got to be restructured as a last step. So this is the right structure, and we are carrying out in a step-by-step fashion in good order.
Timing of this military parade in a training camp, the location of the military parade is very meaningful. Also, the timing is also very meaningful. You have got to take into consideration the current border standoff with the Indian troops. And therefore, many netizens in their millions would ask, where is our armed forces on the border? Why haven't they fought a single bullet? So, do you think the parade itself also conveyed a clear and loud message to our Indian friends? Look, you got to go.
Of course, I think the outsiders might easily think in that way, but I think it has nothing to do with the border dispute between China and India, because it is well planned before the incident happened, before the standoff happens. And secondly, I think this has nothing to do. I mean, the military hardware or the parade has nothing to do with the potential conflict between China and India, if that occurs. I don't think these sort of things could be used in a conflict between China and India, and that will be small scale and very low intensity conflict if it happens. I believe, in my understanding, it's impossible for China and India to have a very large-scale conflict or have a very comprehensive conflict or total war between these two countries. This is only aimed at the show of the development of the capabilities and hardwares of the military of the PLA. And of course, the size is quite meaningful. It is a traditional training ground of the Chinese military in the history. Even in the Yuan dynasty, Genghis Khan started its distant conquering from here, and also Qianlong led his troops to fight against the invaders from here, and this year is here. This is because of it's not National Day. It's the 90th anniversary of the founding of the People's Liberation Army. It is different from the 90 years or 50 years, 50th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. This is one difference. Secondly, I think for the sake of the economy, you can save some money by carrying out the parade there. And thirdly, we will reduce the harassment of the people. If it is held in Beijing, I think the people in Beijing will be harassed to a much greater extent. I think that's why I think it's quite understandable to have this sort of parade in the training ground in Zhuzhihe.
Another message, if you look at the highlights of this military parade in Zhuzhihe, Inner Mongolia, is President Xi Jinping says clearly the Chinese armed forces are ready to provide public goods and public services in, for example, in terms of international responsibilities. And now you have been involved deeply in programs such as fighting piracy, military diplomacy. What can you tell or share with us about our mission in this regard?
Well, people normally talk more about territorial defense rather than his international responsibility. But in China's latest white paper, Safeguard World Peace and provide public goods to the international community, has been characterized as one of the 8 strategic tasks for the PLA. Let's talk about the peacekeeping. President Xi Jinping at the UN summit in 2015 have announced 8,000 standby troops. What does that mean? That is as big as the whole armed forces plus police plus militia of Bhutan. It doesn't look very big for Chinese, but actually it's very big for some small countries. These 8,000 people plus the current 2,300 peacekeepers together would make China the largest peacekeeping troops in the world. Currently we ranks the 12th, but if you put these two, will be the number 1. But what is the message? The message is all the other permanent UN Security Council members are not that much interested in peacekeeping as we are, because the United States, for example, the strongest military with budget is more than 8 countries behind, only have less than 68 peacekeepers in the world. So people have a good expectation for China to play a bigger role in the world.
Thank you so much for sharing with us your insightful comments on the implications of China's modernization of the armed forces, and particularly when the military build-up is described by Western media as assertive.